Hey everyone, today we're continuing our series of intermediate level snakes as far as reptile pets go. So we did the beginner one, we did the intermediate boa one, and so now we're going to do the intermediate pythons. So just to recap, intermediate means a step up in husbandry, in personality, in size, in attitude, in rarity, in the expense and the commonality of the animals. So let's get right into it with what I think is honestly the number one intermediate step up into both size, husbandry, and attitude, the carpet python. So this is Hachi. Hachi is a jungle carpet python, and she is highlighter yellow and nice dark inky jet black. She came to us as part of a collection acquisition. We weren't really sure if we're going to hold on to her or not. And I mentioned this in the carpet python video that we did with her for the species spotlight. But the more I work with her and handle her, I just fall more and more in love with her, which is funny because mostly I really like the Bredlii or the Brettles or the Centralian carpet python, which is actually a different species. And as long as I'm talking about them, I'm going to include them with the carpet pythons. They're actually a separate species, still Morelia, so the same genus, but I'm going to include all of the carpet pythons and the Brettles carpet pythons all kind of together for this one. Now these guys, all of the carpets and the Brettles come from Australia and parts of Indonesia, like Papua New Guinea and different islands in Indonesia. There are several different subspecies. Depending on who you want to get into an argument with, there are anywhere from 5 to 8 different 5 to 8 different species and or subspecies of the different carpets. Morelia people can get very, very defensive about the different aspects when it comes to pure line animals, what is and is not a different subspecies or a pure locality or things like that. So I'm not going to get into that. But these guys are an absolutely amazing group of snakes. So overall, they generally average 5.5 to 7 feet long. So definitely a step up in size. However, some can get significantly longer, like inland carpet pythons and the Brettles to a lesser extent seem to average the largest. And in fact, on record, one inland python that was kept in a collection in Europe was just over 13 feet long. So significantly larger, very similar to like the boa constrictors, where you're kind of looking at the different subspecies or locality, kind of dependent on what size they are. The jungle carpet pythons, arguably the most popular because of the fun different morph combos and lineage and line breeding that's done with these guys, is they usually average in that 5.5 to 6 foot range. These guys, because they come from all over Australia, and as we know, Australia is a land of extremes to say the least, their habitat varies quite a bit from, say, for instance, the Brettles pythons are more of an arid, closer to center of the continents of Australia. The jungles are in one's area, the inlands are in other ones, the coastal in other ones. The Darwins are up in the very top part of the Northern Territory and then into Indonesia, sometimes called the Papuan pythons, formerly the Irian giant carpet pythons, technically all the same thing. Don't fight me, Morelia people. And then even the diamond pythons, which have the furthest south of the range where it can even snow during times of the year in their range. So all that means is that in general, the carpet pythons are a very hardy species of snake, and that's why I think they're a really good choice for intermediate, because these guys are a little bit more hardy, a little bit more bulletproof, a little bit more of a sturdy type of snake to allow for you to figure out working in and dialing in your husbandry practices for the specific species of snake, be it the carpet or the Brettles, and then the localities, like the diamonds usually kept a little bit warmer, the jungle's a little bit more humidity, but overall these guys are a very solid, great choice of snake. The carpet pythons do have a reputation for being a little bit more snappy and a little bit mouthy, especially as young hatchlings and or neonates, however you want to call it. And I think that is a little bit unfair. Snakes, and especially young snakes, the only thing they really have to interact with the world is their face. And so if that's, these giant monsters that we are to these little snakes, that's the only thing that they can do to get us to leave them alone, because they can't run away. But overall, as you can see, this snake, who was very hands-off, very striky, then moving on doing trust building, if you go watch the species spotlight that I did with her, she's on a branch the entire time, and I'm just working with her on the branch and just kind of every once in a while redirecting her and moving around. And this time I just picked her right up, and she's doing just fine, barely even a huff. And that is less than a month apart of working with a really nice, solid, great animal. Now, next up on the list is probably the most uncommon or rare, I guess you could say, animal on this list, and that is the Maclots Python. Now, the Maclots Python comes from the genus Liasis, which is famous for also including things like the water python and the olive python. The Maclots come from several different islands in Indonesia, including but not limited to East Timor and Papua New Guinea. Now, in the genus of the Maclots, so Liasis maclot, there are actually 3 different subspecies, one of which is the smaller, the Savu python, which a lot of people seem to actually prefer because they're a little bit smaller. They have these big, bright eyes, but I really do like the Maclots python. They're a decent-sized animal in that, 6.5 to 7 foot-ish range, with females being a little bit larger, like most pythons. Now, they come from a little different from rainforested areas, and they are semi-arboreal. They're not really categorized as that in general, but they are often found in waist height or taller foliage in trees, as well as on the ground. So that's why, similar to carpet pythons, we usually designate them a semi-arboreal species. So in captivity, we really want to try to give them space to climb, just like the carpet pythons. Now, the Maclots python has a couple really interesting things. They do have those big eyes like the Savu pythons, but they're not quite as like silver in color. But they are very big, very prominent, and then just like Morelia and a lot of other pythons, they have those very big, prominent facial labial heat pits that they use to detect warm-bodied prey. So that's how you know that a lot of the different species of pythons usually end up preying on warm-bodied animals like mammals and birds and ground-nesting birds and all that other fun stuff. Now, very similar to the carpet pythons, the Maclots have a really bad reputation for being very mouthy and very snappy, even as adults, more so than the carpet pythons. Now, a lot of this is to do with they are generally considered more of a display species, as we talked about with the Amazon tree boas in the previous video. They're one that you spend a lot of time getting their setup all nice and correct, and then once established, they make a really nice, really cool display species. But they can be worked with. And so with this animal that oftentimes are wild caught and is very hands-off, they can be a little bit snappy at times. But this is kind of what puts them into this intermediate level where it's once you learn to read your animal's body language, to work on that trust building, just like I did with Hachi and just like you would with any other species of snake or individual in general, you can definitely eventually learn to work them down. Now, Maclot pythons, they're not the most dynamic looking snake. They're kind of that olive green to brownish color, but they do have these really nice, cool, like little white and yellow flecks, and their underbelly is very bright white. So in general, they're not as bright and flamboyant as like the ball python morphs or like the jungle carpet pythons, but it is still just a really interesting and different and beautiful species of snake. So here we have another fine example of working with an animal that came as very reactive, very striky, very defensive, and working with trust building and slowly learning to understand the animal personally, we have a much more handleable animal. This is our female Angolan python. Now, the Angolan python hails from parts of Namibia and Angola, hence Angolan, and they occupy an area of the Namib Desert as well as parts of the western savanna of those two countries that kind of borders that edge. Now, outwardly, these look very similar to ball pythons. You can tell by the head, it looks very similar. They have a pretty, not nearly as chunky, but a bigger sized body with that smaller head, and then the same kind of little cute puppy face with those little labial pits. And even the markings are very similar to the wild type of the ball pythons, but there are quite a few differences between the Angolan pythons and the ball pythons, or royal pythons for any of the people who aren't from the US. And a lot of that has to do with where they live. So as we all know, the ball pythons, they come from sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously these guys too, but significantly further south. And they come from a more tropical area where the humid's very high, and they spend a good amount of time underground in burrows and different termite mounds during parts of the year. And they will venture out of those termite mounds during those parts of the year, and they will go out and they'll find the different rodents and things that they're looking for. These guys, because they come from a desert area where the temps during the day, during the summertime, during the dry season, can be well over 110 degrees Fahrenheit and go below freezing at night, these guys can't be out during those different times of the day and times of the year. And where these guys are often found are tucked away in rock crevices on the ledges and in the mountainsides where these guys are found, or in the more further east part of their range towards the western part of the savanna, that borders the actual Namib Desert. They're found under more traditional areas that you would normally think you'd find snakes, like in burrows and under fallen logs and things like that. Now, with all of that in mind, there are a few other physical adaptations that I mentioned previously that make them a little bit different. If you look very closely, and I'll try to put her close, otherwise I'll get some nice B-roll up in there, you can tell that the scalation of them is significantly different. Now, the ball pythons, as we all know, have very small, soft, smooth scales. These guys have beaded scales, and they have beaded scales for a very important reason. Beaded scales, similar to that of different desert tortoise species, and very famously the heloderma lizards, the Gila monster, and the beaded lizard, that is meant for water and moisture retention. Those hold in moisture much more effectively and sufficiently than the different smooth scales. And even some keeled scales are actually, they've done research to show that those can actually even hold humidity a little bit better than the smoother scales as well. Coming from an area where there is not a whole lot of moisture outside of their rock crevices and burrows, and even then it's not nearly as high humidity as, say, like a ball python burrow. In addition to that, you can tell that they're a little bit longer than ball pythons. These guys average in that 5.5 foot range, where most adult female ball pythons rarely hit that size. These guys can hit 6 foot. So they're a little bit longer, a little bit larger. They're not as chunky as the ball pythons, and their head to body ratio in general is a little bit smaller too. And that's because these guys will go into those rock crevices at night, right as the sun's going down, to catch a little bit of that last minute radiant heat coming off of rocks, a little bit of that UV radiation from that setting sun, and they go into those rock crevices and they poke that little narrow head in looking for other animals. And then again, in parts of the range where it's a little bit more savanna grasslandy, they're going into little burrows, and it makes it a little bit easier for them to grab those prey items. In general, these guys, their care is very simple. You just have to remember it's that microclimate. This is a very good example of a species that deals with the microclimate where they're normally found. It's very arid, it's very dry, it's very hot, and at night and in the winter it's very cold. But these guys occupy areas where they spend their time, not when they're actively seeking out mates or prey items, where it's much more applicable to where we're going to be. I don't know what word that was supposed to be, but it's much more habitable for these guys, or even people, where the temps and humidity is much more regulated and consistent. They're fairly uncommon, but they're starting to pick up. More and more people are starting to breed them in captivity, both here in the States and overseas. But in general, we don't really get wild-caught animals because of the big Angolan civil war that was going on for a very long period of time. And even once that was done, landmines that were buried all throughout their actual range make going in and wild collecting these guys a little bit more something that will definitely cost you an arm or a leg, literally. Here we have another Aussie python, the Woma Python. These ones are a member of the genus Aspidites, and along with the black-headed pythons, these are the pythons that are honestly kind of weird, and sometimes we're not really sure why we even classify them as pythons. They don't have labial pits, as you can see here, if he'll turn his face over here. I don't work with the boy as much as the girl, so this will be a fun little experience for him as well. These guys come from Australia, and they come from the more like kind of red earth, red desert part, although that doesn't mean, just like with the Angolan python, bearded dragons, and everything like that, doesn't mean they're out in the middle of the super hot outback sun. These guys are really, really cool species of python. Now they are, as you can see here, he's an adult male. He's probably about 4.5, 5 feet long, and they typically don't get that much larger than that. Females are usually a little bit larger, again, like most pythons, because of those very large clutches of eggs, or large eggs that they have in general. Usually you don't see Woma pythons over about 6 feet long. Sometimes you can get one closer to 7. Now these guys, you are being very silly today. I know, I don't mess with you too much. These guys in the wild are active reptile hunters, and a big part of their diet is reptilians. They don't eat as many mammals, although they do still as well. Now, what that means is that when we breed them in captivity, sometimes we can have trouble getting them switched over to rodents, i.e. another really fun species of reptile that you could use to have more of a generalistic thing, feeding different species of lizards, feeder snakes, or even reptilynx. Now, these guys, as I said, originally come from Australia, the more outbacky areas of Australia. So what that means is that these guys will spend the very, very hottest parts of the year and the day tucked away in burrows or under fallen logs or tucked under rocks. And then near the end of the day, like a lot of species of snakes, they're crepuscular. then they'll come out and they'll go out and seek other species of snakes, including smaller pythons, and different species of lizard, including small monitor lizards like the Kimberly rocks or the Hachi monitors, and they will snag them in the morning and at night as they're trying to thermoregulate as well, and then they will start to feed on other like ground nesting birds and mammalians right into the beginning part of the evening. But they're definitely more of a visual predator. As you can tell, as we mentioned before, they don't have those labial pits like all the other different species of pythons or those big ones on the rostral scales like pit vipers do. So they're definitely more of a sight and smell versus heat type of python, which makes them a very interesting one. Now, Woma pythons are a good species to have. They don't have a bunch of crazy morphs. There's definitely a little bit more variation in Australia where they can actually keep them. Here in Europe and in the United States, United States is where we are, not Europe, we don't really have access to all the different crazy morphs and stuff like the albino black-headed pythons and things like that. But there is some variation to them. But overall, they're kind of this nice, more orange, brighter head and a more sandy base with these really nice stripes along there. The female that we've had in different videos is a little bit lighter, a little bit more tan than this kind of more milk chocolatey color of the boy. But their care is fairly simple. A nice little heat spot. They do like to bask. So these guys are a definite species that they use cryptic basking, where they will have part of their body, like one coil, thrown outside of their burrow or their hide, and they will bask and warm up and get that UVA and UVB light. So if you use that nice full spectrum UV light, which we probably should be doing, these guys do very well like that. And I would say a minimum of 4 foot enclosure. As you can see, it's a decent sized snake right here, nothing huge, but here, we'll back that up. I don't know, I'm sure if the camera gets the whole thing. You can see he's got some nice size to him. These guys also, like a lot of the different intermediate pythons on this list, have a reputation for being a little bit more facially motivated, we'll say. They're very prey-driven. They have a really great feeding response. They also have a reputation for being kind of hold on and chew, where they'll definitely kind of work that if it's a larger prey item, where, you know, if we confuse them for our hands for a prey item. So it's not something that we really like. And again, this was definitely a more hands-off animal that we got, both him and his girlfriend. But as you can still see here, even though I don't even work with this one nearly as much as his girlfriend, he still does very well, knowing as I sit here and read his body language. And every single type of species and individual is very different, and that's what makes these guys, that once again, an intermediate level of snake, because you definitely have to learn the individual animal's body language, as it's much more dependent for your safety and theirs. But in general, I absolutely love Woma pythons and their larger cousins, the blackheads, as you've seen on multiple videos that I accidentally did mess up with the little copy and paste I got from the wrong article for their Latin name, which somebody was not very happy with me that I did. So apologies for that. And I always try to do my best to correct that, but I'll own up to it every single time when I do make a mistake like that. So carrying on to the last one. Last on the list is the species that I would say is the #1 most iconic, most pictured species of not only arboreal python and snake, but display animal other than, say, a chameleon. And that is the green tree python. And you probably figured out where I was going with that. So green tree pythons are another member of the Morelia genus, along with the carpet pythons, the rough-scale pythons, and the Brettles pythons, and a couple others out there too. Now, these guys hail from parts of Australia and different islands around Indonesia. Now, here in the States, and I don't think in Europe, we don't have the Australian subspecies and or species, again, depending on who you want to fight with. Fairly confident by most people they're considered the subspecies of Australian green tree python, but we have a lot of the other different ones. Now, these guys are absolutely famous for their really cool, just kind of like green honey bun sitting on a branch look to them, and then all of how brightly colored they are. Now, in the wild, most of the time, depending on where they are, they all hatch out bright yellow or bright red. Here, we've now started to captive breed them and line breed them for certain attributes, where we're starting to see even almost black colored little hatchlings and neonates. And as they get older, they go through this autogenic change, which basically just means that they look different as they age. So when they're born and as adults, they look starkly different, and it varies in general. But the green tree pythons are an excellent example of that. So they're born this bright yellow or bright red, sometimes black. and then they eventually turn a bright green, sometimes blue, and then in the case of some of them, they actually stay yellow and they lose their kind of baby patterning. They turn solid yellow. And it does vary in there. Sometimes they can have different fleckings of white and yellow throughout there, and it varies in general between locality, the different lines. And then in captive populations, we've started to line breed them again for those darker quality animals, so they can be. I don't think there's ever been a truly pure black animal, but there are definitely some out there that are very, very dark and very melanistic animals. And so they're found again in Australia, Indonesia, and outside of the designer or the line bred animals, we also go for locality that we usually try to reproduce and try to really stick with nice, high quality visual animals like that come from different islands, like Biak, which I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. I've heard Biak and Biak, and I'll get yelled at for sure no matter which way I say it. Cyclops, Aru, and different things like in different island localities like that. And those are all very specific ones that you'll hear a lot once you start getting into the carpet, sometimes called chondro, because that was a previous designation for them. Into the chondro world, you'll start to kind of see where a lot of people's interests and passions lie, be it the pure locality animals and the more designer animals. Now, a lot of people will say that just like the Amazon tree boas, they're more of an advanced species because of both their reactivity and their husbandry requirements. But in general, the biggest thing that I have come to understand and learn about the chondros, the green tree pythons, or GTPs, and I got that right this time, these guys are, there's no real 100% way, do it exactly this way, and you'll be set, like a lot of different species of snakes. So the biggest thing that people have issues with is keeping up that higher basking spot. It doesn't need to be like super high, like into the high 90s or anything like that. But people have a hard time getting a higher basking spot, high humidity, and giving them vertical room, because that's how these guys are. They're a true arboreal species, very rarely coming down to the ground, other than essentially giving birth and laying eggs. That's about the only time they ever really come to the ground. They do everything else almost exclusively up in the trees and on the branches. So I've seen so many different ways that people do that, where they will take a more sterile approach and they will have a PVC enclosure with like the little pet mat on the bottom with underheat, with different layers, with the different removable perches, 4 or 5 of them at different intervals, and that retains the humidity very well. Sometimes they'll do the full bioactive enclosure, both in like a glass enclosure and a PVC one, where with the glass screen top, they will take a piece of plexiglass or glass or something and limit the airflow to kind of help them retain that humidity, and they'll do the different layers of like little clay balls, and then move up to one level substrate, another level, then the leaf litter, and then still a little water dish in general. There's lots of different ways that it can be done properly. What you just have to do is you have to go and research exactly how, depending on where you live. So if you live in Minnesota, you're going to do it differently than you do in Colorado, than you do in Florida, than even you do in Houston. So just you look exactly how you maintain for some of your more beginner level ones, like your ball pythons or other things like that, and then look how other people who keep the chondros where they are, how that will work for you, which is why I also don't make care guides, because there's no, one way to do it. So I know that I don't ever do the super in-depth ones to do it. This is just kind of a quick little glossary, and then even with the species spotlights, that I go more into the actual animals themselves and their more natural habitats, more than exactly how to take care of them in captivity, because there's no one way to do it, depending on your room, the area you live in, the time of the year, all that other fun stuff. So, sorry, getting a little ranty there at the end. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. If you can, check out the full playlist I have of the top 5 or 5 best, whatever, great choices videos right here. It helps my click-through rate for YouTube. It helps push my stuff, let everyone know that I exist, which is very much appreciated. Please like and subscribe if you can. Hit the bell notification. I'm going to start rolling out different shorts and smaller videos very soon of a bunch of other really cool series, as well as introducing individually some of the animals that you've seen in a lot of the videos. It'll be able to, you can interact a little bit more like that, get more questions about those animals. and all of that little fun stuff that all help to hopefully build this really fun community that we're going into to really help push everyone know about how amazing these different types of animals are. Absolutely love it. If there's any questions, comments, concerns, let me know down at the below in any of the comments. Email me, all the other social media. And if there's any other type of videos that you want me to see, like essentially this whole series is based off of someone leaving a comment and then us going back and forth a little bit about a whole series of videos. So if there's a species you'd like me to cover, a topic you'd like me here to discuss, my opinion about certain things, let me know down in the comments. I always like to hold on to, and I make a note in my notebook. I've now graduated to a new notebook because I filled up the other one almost entirely, and that's what I'll be doing moving forward as well. So again, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Thank you so much. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll check you next time.